40 carrols were bolted to the walls of the cage, 16 to the east wall and 12 to the north and south. Stuck to the floor behind every student's chair was a line of masking tape the width of his carrel. The rule was you were supposed to keep the back legs of your chair in front of your line at all times. As long as your back chair legs were in front of your line, your head would be between the walls of your carrel, which rose 5 feet higher than the surface of your desk and extended 2 feet beyond the desk's edge, because only the thinnest, most flaccid carpet covered the cage's concrete floor. Because all the feet of the chair legs were metal, the noise of the feet rubbing the floor when you'd scoot your chair was a squeaky kind of groan that was wholly distinct from other cage sounds. So breaking the tape rule was a risky move, since Bolta had his desk between the bathroom doors in the middle of the west wall facing east, where a teacher in the cluster in the center of the room was likely to look in your groan's direction. If you were over your tape line, you'd get step 1. Step 1 was a warning. 3 warnings in the same half day? Step 4, detention. While following the tape rule, the only direction you could look that wasn't walled off and didn't end in floor or ceiling was behind you. You weren't able to look at anyone else without conspicuously revolving your head. And so there was also the rule of face forward, which was exactly what it sounds like. The rules of quiet at all times and always be sitting, those were exactly what they sounded like too. Combined with the aforementioned to make it near impossible for students to initiate communication with other students without getting noticed, then stepped by the robots. On top of the rules, the stained color carrel walls were insulated thickly so that whispers below the robot's audio threshold couldn't break through them. And if you wanted to send a message to someone, not only did you have to first ball the paper, folded note trajectories just weren't reliable, which got too noisy if you didn't crumple slowly, and you basically had to be sharing a wall with the intended recipient, for it was near impossible to arc a bald note much greater than the distance than the next carol over with any kind of accuracy, which meant that if Benji Nakamukse was more than 1 carol away from you, a note you wrote him in order to get it to him would have to be tossed to every student between you. And since each in-between student would need to unball it, see if it was intended for him or another, and because no student could see what any other was doing inside of his carol, every between student could and would read the note without any fear of getting beaten up. So even if every kid between the two of you was willing to risk steps for tossing her note, and even if the note did eventually get to Nakamuk without being detected by Bolta or the teachers, the likelihood of which decreased with each potentially noisy D and re-crumpling, you wouldn't have written anything important in the note and thus probably wouldn't have bothered writing to begin with. And for those of you scholars who, at this point, wish to accuse me of blithe exaggeration or of lying for effect, for those of you assuming I'm engaging with metaphor or trucking with expressionism, thinking to yourselves, this place about which Rabbi Gurian tells us seems so overbearingly stifling and hellish that it felt like he wasn't ever allowed to speak to his friends, and at times it felt like he wasn't allowed to even look at them. It was as if they had to stare at flat, unadorned surfaces 6 hours a day in total silence, as though to do otherwise would garner them punishment. For all of you scholars who'd like to insist that a classroom like the cage, given all the violent uprisings in its existence, would daily in sight, couldn't possibly abide for any longer than a week, believe me, I understand your objections. I was prepared no better than by Schechter and Northside to experience the cage's smothering reality than you've been prepared by your Israelite schools to accept that smothering reality's description. As for why the cage wasn't plagued by daily or weekly or at least semi-annual savage insurrections, the short answer is this. Apart from me, the new kid still studying the others in the cage to learn how it worked and how it got worked, its population was not comprised of scholars who'd spent their life studying Torah and Talmud, but rather of kids for whom junior high at all was equal to aptykistic, if not the cage itself. The long answer is harder, a lot more complicated. The long one will take a little while to get across. And I haven't even finished describing the rules. I haven't even gotten to the rule against me. If you were me, you could rarely even toss notes to a kid sitting next to you unless there was no one absent that day. Enough empty carols would be available for Bota to enforce the Gurian has to sit next to no one whenever it is possible rule. For a while that rule had been unconditional. Gurian has to sit next to no one, ever. Because back in my third week at Aptokistic, when Bota originally made up the rule, after catching me toss 11 notes in 1 hour, it was always possible for me to sit next to no one, since the number of carols in the cage was 40, and until the end of my 7th week, the week before the week I fell in love with June, the number of students who were sentenced to the cage, though it had increased fairly steadily from its initial 35, never surpassed 38. And then came Benoit Wolf, number 39, a white-haired 6th grader who cried all the time, which is why people called him the boy who cried wah-wah. Other than how easy and often he cried, nobody really knew anything about him, let alone the reason he'd been removed from normal classes. He never broke rules or spoke to anyone at lunch, but as soon as Benoit got sentenced to the cage, there was hope that I'd sometimes get to sit next to someone. For that to happen, there would have to be no absences at all, and although that circumstance rarely arose, just twice in all of my 9 caged weeks, having something to hope for, no matter how unlikely, was better than having nothing. At least that's how it seemed. And from the moment Bota banned me from sitting next to others till the day Benoit 39'd our roster, nothing's what I'd had in the way of hope. I've learned forthright descriptions of hopelessness are boring, though. I've learned that flowers on the same day that Bota issued the edict described above, which was also the first day I tried to write scripture concerned with the cage, i.e., the first day I tried to start the instructions, even though I didn't know what it would be called yet, or what it was about, or who I wanted to read it. Right there in my corral, I wrote the whole chapter, and I saw it wasn't good. But then I thought I might not be qualified to judge. The chapter, after all, wasn't, at least not directly, about Israelites, the Torah, or Adonai. So that afternoon at the Frontier Motel, I showed the chapter to Flowers to see what he could tell me. "This is boring," he told me. He was sitting on the couch in the welcome office waiting space, chin in his hands piled on the knob at the top of his walking cane, staring at a wall-mounted statue of Legba. I was on the couch next to him waiting for more, and he wasn't saying more. It was my turn to talk. I said, "The cage is boring." He said, "Doesn't matter, pathetic fallacy." I didn't hear it, though. I heard, "Doesn't matter, pathetic phallus," like he was calling me a little wang, or saying I had one. I said, "What do you know about the size of my wang?" He'd never seen my wang. The what?" he said. He took his chin off his hands and turned to me. "I'm telling you about the pathetic fallacy, and you're talking to me about wang? Learn." I was embarrassed for hearing him wrong. I used to hear Flowers wrong a lot. He had an accent from Robert Taylor Holmes, combined with an accent from University of Chicago Law School, and his grammar at times, when he was teaching you something, would become hoodoo grammar, the kind he'd cast spells with. Before starting Aptokistic, I'd only met Flowers once. It was at a fundraising dinner for the United Civil Liberties Advocates of America, which was the organization my father worked for, and the one for which Flowers used to work until he quit lawyering to be a writer when his brother died young and left him the frontier. And for the first few weeks after starting Aptokistic, I'd get embarrassed to hear him wrong because he hardly knew me. And so when I'd heard him wrong, I'd think it seemed I wasn't paying attention. And I'd think that if I'd explained to him that I was paying attention, then it would seem like I meant that the way he talked was advanced. which is not what I would have meant. So instead I'd say nothing and just be embarrassed. The pathetic fallacy day, though, was especially embarrassing because it wasn't just that I'd heard him wrong, but that I heard him talking about my weighing when he wasn't talking about my weighing, which made it seem like I was always thinking about my weighing. So I said to Flowers, sorry. I said, pathetic fallacy. Flowers said, forget the pathetic fallacy. Here's what you write, and there's what you write about. Even if what you write about is boring, you can't be writing boring. Seemed to me like you want to write you weighing. Anyhow. Now you weighing, that's a good example because it's boring to me. Your weighing is boring to most people. Half the world's got wings, and half the writers already written about them. Only thing ain't boring to me about your weighing is how you calling it weighing. You're a creative boy. You're a creative little boy. Know some Yiddish.